So without no further ado, I'll give a brief introduction to our two fantastic speakers today. Thank you, Milan and Cynthia, for being here. Our first speaker, will be Cynthia Orchard. Cynthia is a consultant at ENS with expertise in migration, asylum, nationality, and statelessness, and a particular interest in children's rights. She's collaborated with ENS in various ways since 2016, including the drafting of ENS's 2021 report, Invisible Kids, Childhood Statelessness in the UK. And we'll be sharing resources in the chat as we go, so do look out for any links to reports that are mentioned. Cynthia currently works as a consultant policy advisor with ENS and separately with Kids in Need of Defence UK. Thanks, Cynthia, for being here. And our second speaker is Milan Birles from the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights. Milan is a Slovenian political scientist, politician, and former Speaker of the National Assembly of Slovenia. He's been serving as a member of the European Parliament since 2019, as a member of the Social Democrats, which is also part of the Party of European Socialists. Milan is the Vice Chair of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights, and it's primarily in that capacity that he'll be joining us today as a speaker. So thanks very much to all of the attendees who are here. Thanks to our speakers. And I will pass the floor over to Cynthia to begin your presentation of around 15 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Frances, and greetings to everyone. And thanks very much for joining us today for this very important topic. If we could have the first slide, please. Thanks. I wanted to start with a quote from a Kurdish stateless refugee father from Syria who said, "I too was born stateless. It has had catastrophic effects on the psychological health of all of us because we suffered academically, socially, and politically. Our biggest worry is that our children will be treated unfairly in Europe." And I think this is a really telling quote that points to some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. If we could go to the next slide, please. For those of you who are new to the topic of statelessness and childhood statelessness, statelessness means not being considered as a national by any country. It is a legal anomaly that affects over 500,000 people in Europe, both recent migrants and also people who have lived in the same place for generations. Statelessness affects people in many, many ways, but it affects people individually. It affects families, communities, and wider societies. It can mean exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, poverty, instability, inability to meet one's full potential, and much more. Experiences of statelessness are specific to individuals, and we should really listen to stateless people about how it affects them. Some stateless people are also refugees, and they are among those who seek asylum in Europe from many places of origin, including Syria, Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Myanmar, Kuwait, to name just a few places of origin. The 1951 Refugee Convention mentions that refugees may not have a nationality, but asylum systems in Europe and in other places are largely based on an assumption that everyone has a nationality. And this means that many stateless refugees who reach Europe and apply for protection are not identified as being stateless, and this can cause serious problems. As Frances mentioned, the Stateless Journeys campaign calls on Europe to fulfill its duties to identify and protect stateless people in the refugee context. This campaign was developed and continues to involve some really amazing people who have personal experience of statelessness, who call themselves stateless changemakers. Some of them are shown on the screen on this slide, and there's a lot more information about them, and you can hear from them via video on the Stateless Journeys website. So I encourage you to check that out after this webinar. Next slide, please. These webinars, this series of 4 webinars, are linked to a series of policy briefings, which are on the Stateless Journeys website. And I would encourage you to have a look at those as well. They cover a range of topics, and they're designed to provide short and accessible information for refugee practitioners who are working with people as they arrive at borders or as they navigate through asylum systems and beyond. And the idea is to raise awareness of the needs of stateless people who are within refugee flows and more broadly. Today, of course, we're focusing on the topics of 2 of these primers: children's right to nationality and birth registration. Next slide, please. I wanted to emphasize that the lack of nationality can cause really serious harm to children. Statelessness is itself a violation of a child's rights, and it often leads to other rights violations. A child who's not considered a national of any country is often unable to access various other rights, including, for example, education, welfare benefits, and healthcare. In addition, a refugee child who doesn't have nationality or proof of nationality is unlikely to be able to obtain travel documents or cross borders legally, which puts them at higher risk of having to take dangerous journeys in order to reach a safe country. A stateless refugee child may also be at heightened risk of living in extreme poverty for extended periods and being pushed into exploitive situations in order to survive, including situations such as trafficking, child labor, child marriage, in some contexts becoming a child soldier or other abusive situations. Being stateless can have a devastating impact not only on a child's access to certain rights and services, but also on their sense of belonging and their well-being. Next slide. Fortunately, there is already quite a strong international legal framework to both prevent childhood statelessness from occurring and also to protect stateless children when statelessness does occur. And I'm not going to go into international law in any depth, but I'll just mention a few key provisions which relate to children's rights to birth registration and nationality. So first, the 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons provides us with the definition of statelessness and also sets out the rights and standards for treatment of stateless people, adults and children. And it defines statelessness as a stateless person as someone who is not considered as a national by any state under the operation of its law. And it's important to remember that this definition is also part of customary international law, and so it applies to all countries, regardless of whether they have signed up to the 1954 Convention. The 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness is another key statelessness treaty, and it provides that countries which have signed up to the convention shall grant their nationality to a person who is born in their territory who would otherwise be stateless, and it sets out some conditions for how that should happen. The 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, also sets out some key provisions, including that children have a right to be protected by the state on a non-discriminatory basis, to have their births registered immediately after birth and to receive a name and to acquire a nationality. And the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child protects children's rights to birth registration, a name, and a nationality. And it also contains a key provision about that states are required to consider children's best interests as a primary consideration in all actions concerning them. In addition to these key provisions, there are other treaties which have very much of an impact on these issues. There are also UNHCR guidelines. There are treaty body recommendations and comments and decisions on individual cases, for example, from the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Human Rights Committee. And there's a plethora of other international law which can relate to these topics in some instances. I wanted to just very quickly mention a particular case in which the Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a decision in 2021, which is very relevant to today's topic. The case is called MKAH versus Switzerland, and it concerns a stateless child of a Syrian mother and a Palestinian father. The mother and the child claimed asylum in Bulgaria, but then moved onwards to Switzerland. And they were seeking to be prevented from being removed back from Switzerland to Bulgaria. The Committee on the Rights of the Child found that the removal from Switzerland to Bulgaria was not lawful, in part because the Swiss authorities had failed to consider whether the child's right to a nationality would be fulfilled in Bulgaria and whether removal was in the child's best interests. That case is summarized on ENS's Statelessness case law database, so you can have a look at it there if you'd like to. And I can see that Alexia's just put it in the chat. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what can you do if you're a refugee practitioner, kind of on the front line, assessing, registering refugees or asylum seekers, or helping them navigate asylum procedures? We've come up with 4 R's, so hopefully they're easy to remember. They are recognize, record, refer, and read up. So in order to recognize statelessness, it's really important to make sure that you're asking the right questions about a child's nationality. And these questions include things like, does the child have proof of nationality, or can proof be obtained? Does the child have a birth certificate? And if so, is it actually proof of nationality for the child or their parents? If the child has a birth certificate, are both parents included on the birth certificate? And if not, will this pose difficulties for the child to be recognized as having the same nationality as the parent who's not listed? Do children acquire nationality automatically by birth in the country in which they were born? Must a child be registered with the authorities of the country of either parent's nationality in order to acquire that nationality? And how can they do that in the refugee context? And here I would note that it's really important to remember that refugees should not be expected to contact the authorities of a country in which they fear persecution. And then finally, another key question is, in some cases, whether a child's mother is from a country that doesn't give women the same rights as men to pass on their nationality. And there are about 24 countries which have nationality laws like that, which discriminate against women. And if that's the case, then we need to look at whether the child has inherited a nationality from their father. And then there are lots more questions like these to help recognize a risk of statelessness or statelessness where it does exist on the Stateless Journeys website. There are 2 lists, one specifically for children and another for adults. It's also important to be aware of some indicators of statelessness, which may not be specific to children and are not necessarily definitive of statelessness, but it's good to be aware of stateless groups or groups in which statelessness might be more likely to occur, for example, amongst Palestinians, Kuwaiti Baduns, Roma people, or Rohingya. It's also important to be aware that if a country no longer exists, so if a child is from a country that doesn't exist anymore, or is occupied, or is now a disputed territory, then we should consider whether there may be a risk of statelessness. And wherever a child is from a country which is at war, it is important to think about whether there is a functioning government that can issue the documents that are necessary to prove nationality, or whether the parents are able to contact the government in order to get certain documents. And if not, then this may pose a risk of statelessness in some cases. In terms of recording, it's really important to record statelessness or a risk of statelessness very early in asylum registration procedures so that nationality isn't assumed to exist where it doesn't. And this happens a lot with children. So really important to be aware that it's important to think about the nationality of each family member as they are being registered, and then take appropriate steps if there's no proof of the child's nationality. Also really important to refer children to get legal assistance as soon as possible where there's any risk of statelessness. And if you're struggling to find an appropriate expert, in some cases, ENS may be able to help connect you with someone. And then finally, in terms of reading up, there are lots of resources about childhood statelessness and nationality issues. There are lots available on the ENS websites, including the main website, the Stateless Journeys website, the Statelessness Index, and the Statelessness Case Law Database. And of course, there are lots of other organizations, including UNHCR, UNICEF, the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, and others, which will have really important information about these issues. And I would just say also, if you need a place to start, go to the Stateless Journeys website, have a look at the policy briefings there, and they will link you to some other resources as well. Next slide. So what needs to change? I'm not going to go into this about in much detail, and hopefully our next speaker might pick up on some of these points as well. But just very quickly, some 4 key points that are important. Every country in Europe should have mechanisms to ensure that all children's births are registered promptly and that any barriers to birth registration are removed. All states should have nationality laws that ensure that children who are born in the territory who would otherwise be stateless acquire the nationality of the country of their birth. All states should introduce effective, accessible nationality determination procedures for children who are born on or living in their territory so that they can have confirmation of what their nationality is, or so that they can get assistance to acquire a nationality if they don't have one. And then finally, with respect to asylum registration procedures, states should introduce improved mechanisms in order to accurately record the nationality of refugee children and ensure that those who are stateless are appropriately identified and assisted. Next slide. I wanted to end by quoting one of the stateless changemakers, Pavel, who was stateless from birth. He said, "To have a nationality would change everything. I could wake up and have things to do and things to look forward to." And this quote is from a video on the Stateless Journeys website called Born Stateless. So if you'd like to hear more from Pavel about his story, please go and have a look at the Stateless Journeys website. Next slide. And finally, just to end with a reminder that childhood statelessness doesn't need to exist at all. There are ways to prevent it, and these are achievable. I will stop here, and I'm happy to try and answer a few questions at the end. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our next speaker has to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for the very detailed and informative presentation and slides. And just for everyone's benefit, we will be sharing those slides with attendees after the webinar. I'll now hand over to Milan to continue with your presentation. And just as a reminder to anyone watching, please do feel free to send written comments or questions rather in the chat. And if you can try to keep them as brief as possible, we'd be grateful to allow us to get through a few more. So please do continue that during the next presentation. Milan, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I serve as the co-chair of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights, which is a cross-political group of members of the European Parliament that share the same goal: to mainstream children's rights in all European Union policies and pieces of legislation. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is our starting point, and we work across the political spectrum to ensure that the best interest of the child is always fully upheld all over Europe and beyond. Some reflections on what still needs to change at the state level and how the European Parliament and the Intergroup can support actions in respect of birth legislation and childhood statelessness. So, childhood statelessness is a flagrant human rights violation. Stateless children are stripped away from their very basic rights and do not fully enjoy the rights, with no state to fall back on when things go wrong. This deprivation of their very basic rights put a huge strain on children and prevent them from reaching their full potential and excel in life on equal footing with their peers. Children should never pay the consequences of choices they did not take part of. Stateless children are often the result of lack of birth legislation. Therefore, every country in Europe should have mechanisms to ensure that all children's births are registered promptly and regardless of the parent's nationality, immigration status, lack of identity documents, sexual or gender identity, or other status, and that children are issued with birth certificates without delay. The stakes are high if states fail to provide such mechanisms. I think it is also fair to say that oftentimes stateless children are part of minority groups, be they a result of migration or else as a result of multiple forms of discrimination when they are indigenous. From a purely legal standpoint, it is true that the European Union, we do not have jurisdiction on nationality laws, which still strictly fall under the national competence. However, I would like to stress the fact that all European Union member states have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which clearly states that every child has a right to a nationality, and it is definitely never in a child's best interest to be stateless. Likewise, we do have European Union jurisdiction when it comes to migration. And as Intergroup, we have very much worked in this domain to address the challenges of stateless children as a result of migration. At the EU level, we do have the legal tools to ensure that this does not happen in Europe, and we safeguard children who otherwise will be marked since the beginning of their life with a conviction for things they have never committed. Using tools such as the EU Agency for Asylum Registration, states should be supported to introduce improved mechanisms within the asylum registration process to accurately record the nationality of refugee children born in and living in their countries, with referral to a nationality or stateless determination procedure in all cases where nationality is unclear. Therefore, I think we have an obligation as lawmaker in the EU to encourage all states to introduce or amend nationality laws as needed to ensure that children born in the territory who would otherwise be stateless acquire the nationality of the country of their birth, automatically at birth or shortly after birth, in line with international standards. Children on the move in the context of migration also bring new challenges. Often children left their country of origin in a haste, and some are even born on the move, which makes it complicated for the parents to register their birth. Children born in the EU from migrant parents could also be prevented from benefiting the full enjoyment of the basic rights of citizens if they are not granted nationality at birth. Most of those children will grow up stateless with tremendous consequences for their own well-being. Therefore, I do think that we shall never turn a blind eye to this situation that really jeopardizes child's well-being and hampers his or her potential, contravening the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and all international standards. Member states should introduce effective, accessible nationality determination procedures for children born on or living in their territory, which ensure confirmation of a child's nationality or lack of nationality promptly after birth or in the case of refugee children born elsewhere shortly after arrival. Children should be issued with a document confirming their nationality. As Intergroup, we have been at the forefront to fight children's statelessness, and we have managed to include a clear reference to stateless children in a number of resolutions, namely, the resolution to protect the fundamental rights of children on the move from 2017, the resolution on children's rights on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child from November 2019, as well as the resolution of the safeguards for Ukrainian children and youth affected by the war from 2022. We always strive to take an intersectional approach when it comes to children, so as to ensure that the vulnerability of the child plays a crucial role in any decision concerning a child. Whether it is for a child of migrant background or a child from a national minority, it is essential that there is a case-by-case analysis and every child is given a fair chance to reach their full potential. Stateless children face enormous challenges and huge violation of their fundamental rights if they are not granted the right to a nationality. Thus, we have always included childhood statelessness among the most vulnerable children in all our actions in the Intergroup. I hope to be able to count on more initiatives like yours and maybe push for an own initiative report of the LIBE Committee to address all these challenges and come up with a roadmap at the EU level that paves the way for a concrete legal pathway that allows all stateless children born in Europe to acquire EU nationality of the member state where they are born. Please count on my and our support, and thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milan, for that presentation. We've now got roughly 10 minutes or just over for any questions that people in the audience might like to pose. Just as a reminder, please do feel free to share comments or questions written in the chat. You can direct them to everyone by choosing that rather than the hosts and panelists in the chat function. If there are any reflections or further comments on what was shared, either by Milan or by Cynthia, please do feel free. I know that my colleagues have been sharing quite a few further resources in the chat, and if there's any request for other resources related to the topic, please do say. We'd be very happy to share them, either from ENS or from our partner organizations. I'll give a few minutes. I can see there might be a few questions coming in, so please do feel free to share them in writing. Okay, thank you for the first two questions that I can see. I'll read them out, and then Cynthia or Milan, feel free to jump in to respond. We'll take two to begin with. The first is from Ursi. How is it possible to prove that a person is stateless if she or he is not able to provide documents about his or her statelessness? So something about proving statelessness. And the second question from Elton is, why is there a lack of coordination at European level when it comes to unaccompanied children, especially at state level? I don't know if perhaps Cynthia, you might want to take the first question with regards to registration and proving of statelessness, and then Milan, the second one on coordination at the European level. I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Frances, and thanks for the question about how to prove statelessness. It can be quite difficult to prove a negative, of course, as any of you who have tried to do it will know. The first point is that we should take people's word for things, and a statement from a parent or a child is evidence. It might not be written or documentary evidence, but it is evidence, and it should be treated as evidence as long as it's relatively consistent with internally and with known facts about a country. And sometimes we have to take people's word for things, even if we don't have a lot of objective evidence about a particular situation, because there might not be very much evidence about a particular situation in the public domain. So that's the first really key thing about how to prove statelessness. Sometimes it does come down to people's testimony about where a child was born and where the parents are from. In other cases, it is possible to get some kind of secondary evidence, even if there's no primary evidence like a passport or an identity card that is proof of nationality. So it might be things like evidence relating to where the parents were born, where the parents were married, where the parents went to school, or it might be things like documents indicating that a child was born in a particular country, or it might be something along the lines of an expert report about a situation which is often results in statelessness of children. So there are different ways of proving that statelessness exists for a child, or that they don't have a nationality. But sometimes it's the absence of documents which are proof in itself, but it can be quite difficult. So it's a good question to ask, and good to think about different ways of and being creative in some cases about how you can prove that a child doesn't have a nationality.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'll hand over to you now, Milan, and just to flag as well that there's a second EU-related question from Julia Bradshaw. Will the EU look to encourage the remaining member states to join the European Convention on Nationality, and might signing it become a condition for future membership in the hopes it will help with registration and recognition? If either or both of those you could respond to, I'll leave you.
Not easy questions. First of all, regarding lack of coordination, it comes unfortunately with the lack of or unwillingness at the, let's say, EU level to deal with previous migration and refugee crisis. I would say at that time, everything we has been able to achieve regarding Dublin regulations and all those has been not accompanied with solidarity. And the lack of solidarity actually prevented the possibility to deal with the questions as a whole, in specifically within the Schengen area. I must admit that this is the major obstacle also currently to try to adopt next package which is dealing with asylum, unfortunately I would say there is somehow we are able at the level of the European Parliament to achieve a kind of compromise, but we are unable to achieve a compromise with the Council on the issue. And basically because at least at the level of the European Parliament, we are sticking with human rights framework. We are not going, that EU legislation can contravene international duties and that we have to fulfill. So this is I would say this is the major one. So there is a lack of really even a coordination at this level. Probably now the refugee crisis connected with the aggression of Russia in Ukraine helps somehow. Firstly, we have used this temporary protection directive, But these do not help to actually, in case of statelessness. This is not it is something which is hurrying up the procedure, but it's not necessary dealing with those issues. So if this is so at the general level, then there will be even less willingness to have European Convention on Nationality as one of the conditions for the new member states. Unfortunately, this is the real situation. When you have some states where they had not amended national registration procedure to prevent statelessness to happen, then it is very unlikely that others who are coming in will be asked to do so. Of course, European Parliament can put this as our recommendations, our political will, in our own initiative reports, but those are not really the pieces of legislation. Nevertheless, I still think that, the European Parliament is the institution where some such pressure, some such recommendations can be at least noticed. And then we are trying to, we need to put some pressure on states to do the issue, and the starting point is always in the Parliament for any such a change at the EU level, irrespective of the competencies. There is always the competence of coordination. Yes, I would agree. And the rest is more or less connected with member states and their sovereignty.
Thanks very much, Milan, and Cynthia as well for your answers. And thank you everyone to everyone who's continuing to write questions in the chat. We've got quite a flurry of them. I'm going to pick out two final questions, just because we've only got around 3 to 4 minutes left, unfortunately. And the first is from Ahmed. What might be practical solutions for children of stateless asylees in Europe whose parents' claims have been refused or not been decided yet, be those children born in Europe or not born in Europe? Thank you for that question. And the second from Maruza. What if parents do not want EU nationality for their child? Isn't it more important that rights are provided regardless of statelessness? I might hand first over to you, Cynthia, to respond, and then Milan, if there's anything at the end, please feel free. We've got 3 minutes left, so if it could be concise, that would be great.
Sure. I wanted to address the second question first, if that's okay, about what if parents object to their child having an EU nationality. I would say that's a relatively rare occurrence. And I think it's obviously very important to consider a parent's consent to what nationality their child will have if there's a choice to be made. In that situation, I think it's really important for the children's best interest to be considered as a primary consideration, of course, and the parents' views may be based on their child's best interest, but they might not be. It's also really important for the parents to have really good legal advice in this situation to make sure that they understand what the situation will be if their child doesn't have an EU citizenship, but they're living in the EU. In terms of how we assess that, it can get a bit complicated, and we don't have time to address it fully, but there are a few situations where it might be in a child's interest to not have the nationality of the EU member state in which they're living, at least for a temporary period. So it can get a bit complicated, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Cynthia. And did yourself or Milan have any response to the first question, which was around practical solutions for children of stateless asylees in Europe?
No, unfortunately, I have no idea what we can actually do. What I found also in chat was very inspiring is this idea to go directly for EU citizenship in case that We have a stateless child, and to prevent statelessness at the EU level, something like that can be put, let's say, also within our, I'm not sure, legislation, but firstly, our initiative reports. So, yeah.
If I could weigh in.
And then is additional issue, which is probably important, at least I know my state, when the child is there, found at our territory, and there is no connection with parents, though that we don't know what is the parent. He got or she got immediately Slovenian citizenship. But just in this case. And so legislation at the EU member states level is very different how to deal with the issue. I know also that at the national level we do not have special procedure for statelessness, also within asylum procedure. So some things have to be emulated from state to state and help other states with best practices where things are better regulated.
Thanks, Milan. We've come to time now. I don't know if Cynthia, you were going to interject with kind of 2 final words there.
And I think just really quickly, also really important to think about all the other rights that a child has. So for example, in Europe, we have the European Convention on Human Rights, and the right to private life is very much linked with nationality in some contexts. And so, and the Child Rights Convention, it's also really, really important to think about in this context. So for children who were born in Europe or who are brought to Europe at a young age, really important to think about all the rights that they have, and there are often ways to get them permission to stay, if a residence permit, which might not depend on their parents' status. And I don't have time to go into in great detail, but there are sometimes solutions for children which aren't necessarily linked to their parents' status.
All right, thank you very much, Cynthia and Milan, both for your fantastic contributions and for the answers to the questions. Thank you to everyone who attended. I know we've gone a minute over time. I hope that's okay.